O.J. Simpson case taught police what not to do at a crime scene. That is an article written by Tami Abdollah of the Associated Press. My name is Amber Stutler. We will be discussing that article today and how it relates to communication in the workplace as well as policies and procedures. Everyone has heard of the O.J. Simpson murder trial. It was dubbed the trial of the century. He was the most famous person to be tried for murder in the United States. O.J. Simpson is a Hall of Fame NFL running back and was a Heisman Trophy winner. He was also a spokesperson for Hertz rental cars, and he was also a broadcaster. So his name was very well known, and that became a big play in this case. On June 12, 1994, Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman were brutally murdered at around 10:30 p.m. Their bodies were discovered shortly after midnight when neighbors found Nicole's dog when it had bloody paw prints leading them to the scene. Police arrived to find a forensic jigsaw puzzle. They had blood everywhere. Nicole's throat had been slashed and she bled out from her carotid arteries. And there was blood all the way through the sidewalk. Police entered the scene, did not take much regard for contaminating evidence. They were seen with their feet up against railings that the evidence hadn't been gathered from yet. They missed 5 blood droppings that was on Nicole's back. This would have indicated that the blood would have been from someone else. They presumed the killer, but these 5 blood samples were not swabbed and sent for testing prior to her body being moved. Therefore, they could not be used. Johnny Cochran was one of the defense attorneys, and he referred to the LAPD Scientific Investigation Division as a quote-unquote cesspool of contamination. Detectives also found 5 drops of blood leading away from the scene, which would have been on the left side, indicating that it was probably the killer had some sort of a wound on the left side of their body. They also found the left glove on scene and a hat. They also found some footprints. They also found some socks in the bedroom of Simpson when they went to his estate over on Rockingham. There was question as to why police accessed Mr. Simpson's property when no one answered the gate. One of the detectives, Mark Furman, said that he spotted blood on what they presumed to be Simpson's white Ford Bronco parked outside his house. This ended up being about the size of half a circumference of dime, and he thought that that meant somebody was possibly bleeding to death was his reasoning. Defense did question all of this and as to why they were on the property at all. 4 detectives and 1 supervisor all testified that it was for concern of Mr. Simpson's safety, and they did not believe that he was a suspect at that time. Police were able to access the property. They spoke to someone that was staying in the guest house, and they also spoke to Mr. Simpson's daughter to find out that he was out of town in Chicago. They then contacted him via telephone from his home to notify him of his ex-wife's murder and to supposedly secure where the children were going to be taken. Mr. Simpson arrived back from Chicago the following morning. He spoke to police without an attorney, and he also provided a blood sample to police. Detective Van Adder had this blood sample, but he did not take it immediately to be booked. He returned back to the scene of the crime on Bundy Drive, and he wanted to say which order that this evidence was going to be entered in. Well, once he re-entered the crime scene with Mr. Simpson's blood, that became very questionable when the defense raised that the LAPD was setting Mr. Simpson up for this murder. So he had the blood in his possession for a time period of over 2 hours, and he returned to the scene of the crime with it. One of the coroners stated that the same detective had requested blood samples from both victims, Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, so he also could have had those blood samples as well as Mr. Simpson's samples in his possession at the same time, and was the only person to be known to have them. Now, this broke the chain of custody and called all this evidence into question. Now, what the defense won out on and the prosecution was embarrassed by was they put Detective Mark Furman on the stand. Detective Furman found the right bloody glove on Mr. Simpson's Rockingham estate. He also found a lot of evidence over at the South Monday murder scene. Mr. Furman testified for the prosecution. The defense was absolutely shocked that they actually called him to testify because they found a suit where Detective Furman had tried to sue for disability from the Los Angeles Police Department, the City of Los Angeles, because his job as a police detective in Los Angeles had led him to hate African American people. He was on record referring to them as the N-word in his testimony for this thing. Now, the defense attorney asked Mr. Furman on the stand whether he had ever used the N-word in regards to an African American person in the last 10 years. He testified that he had not ever said that. Well, they also had a witness that testified that when she consulted Mr. Furman for a movie, that he referred to all black people as the N-word on multiple occasions. And they also had the text from the lawsuit. So now he has perjured himself, and the jury cannot believe any of the evidence that he was able to find or anything that he testified about. He completely lost his credibility, as did the prosecution. Now, this was a lack of communication on their part with the LAPD. Somebody should have been able to identify that Detective Furman had filed that lawsuit, considering it was against LAPD. And they also should have known more about him from officers around him to know that this may have been an issue, especially when the murder victims were both white and the defendant was an African American. This became a huge deal. This was Los Angeles in the 90s. They had had a lot of issues with the LAPD. They had been accused of a lot of corruption. So with all these things being found in a high-profile case, a lot more of it came to light, and change was going to be forced to be made. The mistakes at the scene were unacceptable. The LAPD's criminal investigation found it hard to account for their evidence. Now their analysts said that they take a lot more notes as to the times and locations and a lot more in their standard procedures in regards to evidence. And they established their crime lab, and it also became accredited in 1997 with the additional funding secured from the city and the county and the state. And all of the employees at the LAPD, from the top level to the bottom level, were able to work on a new system that assured that the LAPD's gathering of evidence would be compliant and they would be able to actually prosecute these criminals. They feel like they lost the case a lot based on the defense's ability to prove that the evidence was contaminated. Although there was an overwhelming amount of evidence, very little of it was not exposed to some sort of contamination. They had left evidence on the scene inside a van on a hot summer day. It had overheated there. They had failed to test some blood samples for up to 2 months after the scene. They also went back and acquired new blood samples from a gate at the Bundy residence 3 weeks after the murder took place. The crime scene was washed down 36 hours after the bodies were found, eliminating all that additional evidence that police may have missed the first time. Now they say that their scenes are a lot more secured, that a detective or any member of their department would not be allowed to re-access a murder scene with evidence, as Detective Van Adder did with O.J. Simpson's blood sample. They also have a scanning device that they use to scan all the evidence into, so they can keep a better location of it and to keep better account of it. Communication is a key element to any organization, but it's crucial for an organization where guilt comes into play. And the LAPD recognized this and made significant changes, and this was definitely a case of what not to do at a crime scene. Now, the other issue they did have was that they had taken a blood sample from Mr. Simpson. Now, the lab technician had initialed that he had taken 8 mLs of blood from Mr. Simpson. The lab was only able to account for 6.5 mLs of blood. They said that they presumed that the vial was not full when the technician drew it and that he, just out of habit, initialed it. But he could not recall as to whether there was actually 6.5 mLs or 8 mLs taken. Now, the amount of blood found of Simpson's at the crime scenes came up to a lesser amount than 1.5 mLs. This is what the defense brought. So now you have 1.5 mLs missing of Mr. Simpson's blood from the LAPD and less than that found as evidence. So this played a key part in exonerating Mr. Simpson. Again, we're not here today to talk about whether or not Mr. Simpson's guilty or not guilty. That's been a big controversial issue. But what we're looking for is to see how, even in the most adverse situation, you can look at your organization and work with your team members and your bosses and come up with new policies and procedures to make sure the organization is way more effective. I would like to close with a quote from Doreen Hudson. She heads the crime lab of the LAPD. She was also worked the crime scene at Mr. Simpson's house. She says that the only thing you can do is when something really bad happens is to try to make something good of it. And I can say that the LAPD definitely did this. Thank you for watching my video.